So hopefully you can see my slides at this point, and I'm going to go ahead and consent to being recorded. All right. So the talk for today was to discuss ways to manage stress, and I'm guessing at least some of you who have joined are experiencing some degree of stress these days. It would be unusual not to, and I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about some ways to deal with that, to cope with that, and to improve some resilience. So I don't think I need to spend much time talking about what stress is, but certainly it has a couple of different domains to it, including an emotional piece. It's usually some kind of a response to something that's either environmental or psychological. Sometimes there are external stressors or internal stressors. But one way to think of it is that the demands of either an internal or an external situation have exceeded your resources, whether internal or those that are around you, to deal with that change or event. And certainly there is a physiological reaction that occurs in the context of stress. When a stressor is acute, you can think of this as you're hiking down a trail and you run into a bear and you get the fight or flight response, and that is kind of an immediate neuroendocrine and biological response that occurs, typically activation of your sympathetic nervous system, and then a reactivation of your parasympathetic system after the stressor or the threat is gone. The challenge is sometimes stresses aren't acute and they are indeed persisting and chronic, and that's when you start to see changes both on a physical level but also in the way that we operate in the world. So there's a psychological response. There are certainly interpersonal or social responses. One of the classic features of chronic post-traumatic stress disorder is avoidance and kind of a deactivation. There are certainly measurable biological changes that come from the adrenal glands as they get kicked off by parts of our cortical and subcortical structures. And this is a kind of a well-known phenomena, but not a lot of great data in terms of the most effective ways to deal with stress. And I think that's a heterogeneous, we all do it differently. And that's one of the things I wanted to mention right out of the gate, is that I would not offer this presentation as the definitive way to manage stress. There's as many ways to do that as there are individuals, but hopefully giving you some ideas about ways to deal with that. Chronic stress, certainly there are a bunch of things that happen within our systems. We get changes in terms of the way our body processes fuel, so our blood sugar and insulin reactions. There are changes that co-occur in terms of thinking abilities. Not uncommon to hear someone say that, boy, after periods of prolonged stress, I don't feel like I process information as well. My memory is not as sharp as it used to be. And certainly there are also things that open the door for further infection or inflammation or other responses. Very, very basic kind of an overview of the brain. And this becomes important in terms of what happens when we think about what happens in the brain as we experience stress. So we have our central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and that's the kind of the macro level. The micro level is that you've got a cell at the most fine layer, which has a cell body, an axon, and there's communication that happens between cells, and passive activation underlie cognition. And what we know is that chronic stress, so stress over the period of years, is not great for your brain. And there are some areas of your brain that respond in some key ways. One is that parts of the brain that are involved in the threat appraisal system actually get bigger. They become more potentiated, and the parts of the brain that are sensitive to those hormones, like the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, actually get smaller and shrink over time. This is not I had a really stressful period for a month or two. This is years and years of persistent stress. A lot of this data comes from the Department of Defense and the VA around what happens with veterans with PTSD or with chronic assaults or other data. You see it at the cellular level. where some cells in those parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, both important for memory, in animal models where they experience chronic stress, there's less dendritic arborization and connectivity, and then some parts of the brain that are involved again in scanning the environment for threat actually get more complex for a while, but they can't sustain that and also start to dwindle over time. So again, well known. Also well known that there is no avoiding stress. There's no escaping it. There's no becoming 100% comfortable with it. Certainly most people would say stress is unwanted. We just talked about some of the reasons that it's not the best for your health. But I would also offer you, and you may think about times in your life, maybe now, maybe other times, where you managed stress well. And you may also be able to identify some places where stress may have actually been beneficial in the right amounts. So I would say that, it's a natural part of the business of living. And it's our job to figure out ways to enhance resilience and grit and fortitude to be able to cope with it. And again, no magic bullet here. There's nothing I or anyone else could offer you that is the definitive way to do this. I did want to share also that there's some lovely data around the right amount of stress and how that can actually help thinking abilities. And there's this nice curve of too little, and we don't really rise to the occasion or aren't spurred to do maybe what we could. Too much stress is certainly deleterious and just yields anxiety and interference, but there's that sweet spot of kind of pushing us to peak performance. And this curve is different over time and for different people, but it's a well-known thing also. When we get to the piece of how do we manage stress, what are the things that we have some evidence around that are helpful? Certainly one of the most helpful is physical activity, especially things that involve cardiovascular exercise, which releases another set of hormones that counter cortisol and enhance cellular response and overall health. Also, people find that less cardio-intensive activities like yoga or Tai Chi, certainly, or weightlifting even, are beneficial for managing stress. There's kind of this idea of getting out of your head and into your body, given that our stress response is sometimes mediated by cognition and the way we think about things. Similarly, there are spiritual practices, prayer, transcendental meditation, other forms of meditation. I would offer you that there are probably as many forms of meditation as there are meditators. Everyone does it slightly differently. And other practices, one of my favorites is a gratitude practice, where you're not negating the things that are difficult or that you wouldn't have chosen to have unfolded in your life, but to also take stock of the rest of the picture, the things that you're thankful for. Maybe parts of the body that don't hurt or are working well, parts of our cognitive domains or function that are preserved and working well. Certainly a connection with something larger like nature. So many, many ways to do this. I'm going to throw in one cartoon. Usually try to put in one per presentation. This is one of my favorites, where you've got someone lying on the psychiatrist's couch saying, "Could we up the dosage? I still have feelings." And I do not put this up here to make light of antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications, but I do put it up here as a kind of a common denominator of we have difficulty dealing with difficulty. It's hard to experience distress. And one of the things I've become most interested in over the last 10 to 15 years are things that enhance distress tolerance. Again, we cannot remove stressors from our plate. And that's a common term, right? Of, oh, I've got a lot on my plate. And for many of us, there are things on our plates that we can't remove, whether it's health conditions or cognitive disorders, could be a variety of things. And these aren't avoidable. So if we can't get those off of our plate, how do we make our plate bigger or thicker? And that's where I think about distress tolerance and stress management as being incredibly important. And what I was hoping to focus on today, and for those of you who have been through ADAPT, or some of you who have seen in the clinic, or been in other parts of practices here in the Seattle area, mindfulness meditation has gotten a tremendous amount of attention in terms of how it may be useful to deal with stress. And there's a lot of information in the press. There's mindfulness in schools and prisons, and it's a little concerned that it's being touted as the be-all, end-all that helps with everything. It does not. And it's also, I think, worth describing a little bit about what it is if you're not familiar with it. But it's really, when you think about it at its core, it's kind of attention training. It's working on ways to stay present in the here and now, and not the then and there. So it's easy sometimes, and for some of us maybe it's easier than others, to drift back into the past and how things were 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And we run the risk of mythologizing our pasts. Or it's also easy to project ourselves way out into the future and try to anticipate, boy, if something's this bad now, what's it going to be like in 5 years or 10 years? And both of those activities of reviewing the past or trying to anticipate the future bring us out of the present moment. And the present moment is where we operate and have some domain over changing things or dealing with things. So it's really a practice of bringing your attention back to the here and now, which is helpful while you're doing it, but also has some downstream effects of being able to catch yourself when you do those things. It's really about engaging with the present moment, including all the difficulties and stressors that are present. So it's not trying to escape from them or push them out of your mind, but to accept them with a non-judgmental curiosity. So it's not just kind of relaxation techniques or this kind of Herculean task of trying to empty your mind of all thoughts. Usually when I start talking about this with people, they would say, "Oh, I've tried meditation, I'm not good at it." And it's not a mastery event. It's a practice over time, and I don't know anybody who can empty their mind of all thoughts. I think the natural activity of the mind is to produce thoughts. What you do with those thoughts is maybe a different story. A couple of definitions by people who are much better suited to define it than I would be is that mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And that last piece is a key. And also, again, this idea that we exist in the present moment. Probably a good idea to keep an eye on the future and an eye on the past, but really the majority of our focus could be here and now. You can also kind of look at this from a visual perspective if you're a visual learner, which I tend to be, is that we have these discs here are meant to represent some lenses through which we look at things that have happened or might happen. And you can almost imagine it like the further you get underwater in a pool, the more distorted those visions of what's on the surface becomes. Again, thinking about the past or the future. So really bringing back to what is right here, right now, in this moment, versus what if or what was. Some of the core attitudes, not that you have to embark on a mindfulness practice, but that you work on cultivating over time. One of non-judgmental, so not judging the unpleasant aspects of the current moment or your practice or your abilities. So if your mind wanders once or 100 times, there's no judgment about that. The importance of the beginner's mind, and this is something I think that kind of is at the foundation of this practice of staying open to possibilities. In the beginner's mind, the possibilities are endless. In the expert's mind, they are few. The other piece of this that we'll come back to in a little bit is around acceptance, that there are parts of my current experience that I cannot change. I can change how I react to them or maybe how I deal with them, but I can't deny them out of existence. And then the other is freedom from attachment, which is a little tough because sometimes people approach a practice like this of how long is it going to help how long is it going to take to help me fall asleep? Or how long is it going to take until my pain levels are lower? Or how long is it going to take before my attention improves? And you can't pursue it with that. These are benefits that kind of come with the process, but if you're doing it for that purpose, you're going to be disappointed, typically. Again, there are a variety of practices. This is not a dogmatic thing where you have to do it the same way all the time. A couple things that people tend to usually start with. One is mindfulness practice around the breath. I usually think of it as kind of the BMW model, the body, the mind, or the world. And there are parts of the current moment that you could pay attention to. So it could be sensations in the body. It could be things that are happening in the outside world, like sounds or things that you see. It could be the mind, paying attention to thoughts and but not being overly attached to them or wrestling with them. People do mindfulness meditation while they're walking or chopping the vegetables. Really, whatever anchor you choose to the present moment is up to you. It's the practice is you are paying attention to that. And when your mind drifts to worrying about what might happen next week or the thing that went terribly wrong a couple hours ago, you just notice that and gently redirect your attention back to whatever that present moment anchor is. It's that simple and that difficult. A couple words about kind of what we know about what happens in the brain when you develop a practice like this. So there's a growing body of literature that looks at changes in cortical structure and function. So the brains of people who meditate look different than those who don't. And there's some kind of the connectivity of the brain changes. The ability of the brain to shift from this kind of resting state to a task state improves. People tend to do better on things like selectively attending or being free from distraction, which makes sense when you think about what you're training the brain to do in a practice like this. And they also tend to be a little bit more flexible in terms of problem-solving approaches. So that ability to think about, oh, if this isn't working, what else could I do? I think one of the interesting downstream benefits of mindfulness meditation is to notice that, oh, I'm doing this again, and decreasing kind of the emotional reactivity of when something isn't going right or according to your own plan, to say, okay, step back, think about how else might I respond to this or handle this, and then choose instead of a stimulus reaction. It's more of a stimulus response. Here's a nice overview from a few years ago now that looks at a couple of different types of meditation, and these are fMRI and MRI studies, as well as some with cognitive data. And what seems to change or benefit. What I would draw your eye to, though, is this one right here, the Holzell study from 2011, because some of these, when we look at experience with meditation, this one was meditation naive. So these are people who had never meditated before, and what they did was they taught them how to do a kind of a mindfulness-based approach. They did it for about 8 weeks of training, and then had them practice. And a year later, they looked at their previous MRI compared to a follow-up MRI, and the yellow areas are changes in thickness. And what you see is, as a composite across the study, those that were in the meditation group had thicker parts of their anterior cingulate gyrus and medial frontal gyrus, both of which are important in terms of attention, concentration, freedom from distractibility. Maybe a little bit more on the left than the right, which makes sense that this is a kind of a verbal practice. So, interesting, small sample sizes, and certainly would need to be replicated, but there's more and more data that would say that our experience and the things that we do helps with that kind of plastic component of the brain. So what I guess I would offer you is that this is, if you're looking for something to augment your current armamentarium of stress management approaches, mindfulness meditation is pretty lovely in the sense that it is kind of low intensity. You don't need a lot of training. You need a lot of practice, but you don't need a lot of training. There are plenty of excellent resources. There's emerging interest and applications for this. I also like that it's not a replacement for any kind of either a spiritual or meditation practice. So I've had folks who have done transcendental meditation for years and years and years who have said, oh, I already have a practice, and that's great. This is one that you can supplement that with. You don't have to replace it at all, or a spiritual faith. I would also say it is not a cure-all. It requires effort, and it requires some discipline, which is kind of tough. There's a couple of other components that I wanted to address. One is the importance of self-compassion. And this is a bit of a tough grasp sometimes, in terms of we can be compassionate with others, but we have a hard time being compassionate with ourselves. Maybe that's true for some of you more than others. But that critical piece of accepting flaws and faults and not letting yourself off the hook. So it's not a free pass to, not do anything or be a jerk or, handle things in ways that aren't congruent with your values. But it is this kind of being gentle and kind to yourself. It's not self-esteem, but it's really about accepting that this is where I'm at right now, and there are things I can work on and will continue to work on. I also think this is critically important right now. I don't know how many of you have come across this, but I worry with this theme of, during this time of quarantine and disrupted schedules, you should come out of this with a new skill or more physically fit. It's perfectly okay if you do not, right? So it's okay to have a hard time with things. So self-compassion, and Kristen Neff has a really lovely set of mindful self-compassion practices. There's some really good stuff with this, and there are a few good local resources as well. And I wanted to maybe close out, I'm looking at the time here, with a couple of words about acceptance, which is another, I think, tough ask sometimes. So acceptance, really, if you think about at its core, it is not giving up or throwing in the towel or quitting. It's also not kind of beating your head against the wall or swearing at the universe. It's really just a non-judgmental acknowledgement of this is the way things are. You think about the weather, right? So if it's raining outside, you kind of have to accept the fact that it's raining. You can't barter or deny or argue with the weather and change it. If you can, maybe talk to me afterwards. But I think the piece of acceptance is that you can couple that with action. That you would, doesn't mean you wouldn't have a raincoat or an umbrella, right? So it's not just, I'm not just going to stay inside, or there are ways to handle it. And one of my favorite phrases that I heard from someone dealing with some neurological difficulties was, I can't fight this, so I might as well dance with it and lead as much as possible, which I really thought was a lovely sentiment. A couple of resources. One, if you are here in the Seattle, King County, Snohomish County area, Mindfulness Northwest is a great website that lists different meditation practices, groups. The Seattle Mindfulness Center also has some excellent calendar resources. If you are more of a kind of a home learner, and maybe for the next few weeks, this wouldn't be a bad thing to check out. On the left here, the Mindfulness for Beginners, the 2 CD set of that is really excellent. So CD1 is a detailed and sometimes a little dense overview of the mindfulness and applications. CD2, however, is a nice mix of mindfulness guided meditations, anything from about 3 minutes up to about 30 minutes. Some with movement, some that are more still, and then the full 8-week kind of mindfulness-based stress reduction manual is the Full Catastrophe Living, which is an excellent resource also, but that's a commitment and helps to have a program that you attach that to help move through it. I also threw my contact information up here. I'm happy to send you out the slides or other resources if you like. And I think that's all I had for you.